I often get asked why I choose cold pressed paper over hot pressed paper and vice versa. Today I'm going to answer that question while I demonstrate how I painted parts of this pansy on both hot pressed and cold pressed paper. I have a stash of watercolour paper here at home in this big paper cabinet. In this cabinet you will find both hot and cold pressed paper. I have full sheets of both, and I have pads and blocks of both. I even have a roll of watercolour paper that I can cut. When I paint, sometimes I'll use hot pressed paper and sometimes I'll use cold pressed paper. Many of my students who are new to painting in watercolour will often ask me why I chose hot pressed paper over cold pressed paper for a particular painting. And my answer is usually the same. I don't have a particular reason for choosing one over the other. I enjoy using both. I mix it up for my own enjoyment. If I've been painting on hot pressed paper for a few paintings in a row, I'll switch to cold pressed for the next one. There are, however, two exceptions that will make me choose hot pressed over cold pressed, which I'll talk about at the end of this video. There is another textured watercolour paper that you can buy called rough paper. I don't use it, so I'm not going to talk about it in this video. I'll focus on hot and cold pressed only. I'll also only be comparing arch paper. Obviously different papers are going to have different tooth and different qualities, so I'll stick to the paper that I'm most familiar with. So what is the difference between hot pressed and cold pressed paper? Basically the difference is the tooth or the texture of the paper. Cold pressed is more textured than hot pressed, and hot pressed paper is smooth. Some people say that hot pressed paper doesn't absorb water as quickly as cold pressed paper, which means you should have more time to work with the paint. Now, I've never paid attention to that myself, so I thought I'd do a quick test on some scrap paper. On the left I have some arch cold pressed paper, and on the right I have some arch hot pressed paper. I'm wetting them both at the same time with some water. I've put the camera on time lapse so that I can see whether one paper absorbs the water quicker than the other. I left them for about 10 minutes or so, and I came back and this is what I found. This is the hot pressed paper. It's still wet, it has a sheen on the surface. This is the cold pressed paper. It's also still wet, but the sheen isn't as shiny as the hot pressed paper. So you can see over here, there's more of a sheen there on the surface. So it's slightly wetter than the cold pressed paper. Even though the cold pressed paper is wet, it's not as wet. So if I drop some paint onto the paper while it's like this, let's see what it looks like. So there was movement on the hot pressed, but not quite as much movement on the cold pressed. So this is the hot pressed, so it moves straight away, but here on the cold pressed, it tends to sit longer than what it does on the hot pressed. So yes, from that I would agree that cold pressed paper seems to absorb the water quicker than the hot pressed paper. I'll drop some paint onto the dry paper to see if there's any difference. So that's the cold pressed. And now onto the hot pressed. Now that looks fairly similar on both papers, but it looks like the cold pressed might absorb it a little bit quicker than the hot pressed. That paint on the cold pressed paper around the edge seems to be soaking in quicker than the paint on the right there. So there's not much in it, but I agree cold pressed paper absorbs water slightly quicker than hot pressed. I have read that if you like to make use of blooms in your paintings, which I do, then hot pressed paper works better for that. So I had to try that out as well. So let's have a look at the cold pressed first. I'll put some paint on there the dry paper, and I'll put the same colour onto the hot pressed. Okay, so that's the same colour on both papers. I'll drop some water onto them to create a watercolour bloom on each. So this is the cold pressed and the hot pressed. I let them sit for a minute or two, and then I dropped another water droplet on there. So they've sat for a little while. I'm just dropping some more water on there now just to see what happens. I'll speed it up so you can see. And it seems that the watercolour bloom on the right hand side on the hot press paper seems to be creating more of a dramatic watercolour bloom there. After doing those little tests on the scrap paper, I thought the best way to further compare the two surfaces would be to paint the same subject on each paper. So I painted this pansy on hot press paper and also on cold press paper. So let's have a look at that. I'll start with the pansy on the cold pressed paper. I'm going to work on wet paper because I find the paint goes on easier when I wet it first, and I don't necessarily want a flat wash over the petal. This is Winsor Violet that I'm using, and I'm using a Da Vinci Maestro brush here. This is a series 35 Maestro brush. So I paint that onto the wet paper. The paint goes on really easily with that water that's on the paper, and it gives me that uneven wash that I want. This is the hot pressed paper, and I'm going to do exactly the same thing. I've just wet it, and now I'm painting on some Winsor Violet. Straight away I can feel the difference between putting the paint on the hot pressed paper and on the cold pressed paper. It seems to slip all over the surface here, whereas on the cold pressed paper it absorbed into the paper quicker. So it's a little more difficult to lay the paint down evenly on this surface. It tends to float on top. This is the cold pressed and this is the hot pressed. And this is how they look side by side. They look similar. Like I said, I didn't want an even flat wash. I wanted to see the paper showing through in places. Even though it was a little harder to paint the petal on the hot pressed paper, it has dried just as well as the cold pressed paper. So then I continued on. This is the cold pressed paper that I'm working on. I've done the same thing. I've wet it first. And now I'm going to drop in some French ultramarine to add interest. And those colours blend well together. Here I'm using my brush as a sponge to lift some colour off the paper, and that creates a highlight there. So my brush is damp, the paper is damp, and that just sucks a bit of that paint back off the paper. And then that reveals the whiteness of the paper, creates a highlight. And then I do the same thing on the hot pressed paper. Dropping in the French ultramarine onto the damp paper. And again, I find the paint is slipping over the surface rather than being absorbed the way it was on the cold pressed paper. It just seems to sit on top. And that gives me a little longer to work the paint. Now I'll lift some paint off just like I did on the cold pressed paper. And that seems to feel the same on both papers. It lifts fairly easily. to the cold pressed paper now, and the Winsor lemon is beautiful and bright. It goes on quite easily. I'm painting on the dry paper here. And here it is on the hot press paper, and it's much the same. Now I'm starting to paint the darker markings. I'm layering one colour over the top of another. I'm working on damp paper here. This is cold press that I'm working on. So I've got a lot more pigment mixed into my paint. And I do the same thing on the hot pressed paper. So I've dampened this section where I'm working. And again, the paint isn't absorbing as quickly as it does on the cold pressed. Here I'm dropping in some quinacridone magenta. Back to the cold press now. I'm painting some colour along the edge. I've dampened the edge of the petal, and I'm using quinacridone magenta. I'm doing the same thing here on the hot pressed. Down the bottom here, this is the cold press paper. This is Winsor Violet again. I do the same thing here on the hot pressed. Although this is not difficult to do, I think it is slightly easier to do on the cold pressed paper. It just seems to be a bit more forgiving on the cold pressed. I'm using my liner brush now to paint on the fine lines. This is the cold pressed paper that I'm working on. I'm using the Winsor Violet. So now I'm doing the same thing on the hot pressed. And the cold press felt very similar to this. I couldn't really tell that there was any difference between the hot and the cold press putting this fine work on. And I found the same thing here. I'm still working on the cold pressed. I'm painting in the centre. And it's just as easy to paint it on the cold pressed as it is the hot pressed. So here I am painting some ink on the cold pressed, just adding some more detail along the edge. Here I'm on the hot pressed and I'm doing the same thing. It feels much the same. So there they are side by side. The cold pressed is on the left and the hot pressed paper is on the right. I don't see a great deal of difference in them, but I do feel that it was slightly easier to paint the flower on the cold pressed paper, mainly because the paint was absorbed into the paper more readily, whereas on the hot pressed paper it tended to slip and slide on the surface for longer. Once you get used to that, you can use it to your advantage because it gives you longer working time with the paint. Overall, I don't see much difference between the two paintings. I think the colour might be slightly brighter on the hot pressed, but that's debatable. I have to say though that this time when I was focusing my attention on the differences, I enjoyed painting on the cold pressed paper more than the hot pressed paper. I definitely found it easier to apply the washes on the cold pressed paper, and I've never noticed that before. When would I choose hot pressed paper over cold pressed paper? I have two reasons. The first is that I sell a lot of prints of my work, and what I've found is that the paintings that are painted on the hot pressed paper tend to reproduce slightly better than those painted on the cold pressed paper. Now, it's only a very slight difference and it's nothing to be concerned about. I'll show you what I mean here with this painting. It's painted on cold pressed paper. This is a print that I made of the giraffe painting. Because it was painted on the cold pressed paper, if you look closely, you can see the texture of the paper on the printed part of the print. Now, technically there's nothing wrong with that, but I'll show you the difference when I print from a painting that I painted on hot pressed paper. This cockatoo painting is painted on hot pressed paper. And here's the print that I made of it. Now if you look closely at that, there's no texture that you can see in the painted surface because there was no texture on the paper. So a painting on hot pressed paper might reproduce better if you're working in licensing or if you're illustrating a book or something like that. So as far as printing goes, the difference between the two papers is only slight, and you probably wouldn't even notice unless I pointed it out to you. The other reason I might choose hot pressed over cold pressed is if I'm painting a very detailed subject and I want to show lots of detail, or if the subject to paint is quite difficult. Sometimes I can save a failed painting with the use of watercolour pencil or plain coloured pencils. And I find it easier to use pencil on hot pressed paper because it's smoother. So choosing the hot pressed paper gives me some peace of mind if I'm going to paint a difficult subject. When I first started painting in watercolour, I used cold pressed paper. When I got a bit more experience and I began to sell my paintings, I ordered some hot pressed paper to try out. So I had developed some skill with watercolour before I tried painting on hot pressed paper. So my advice, if you're just starting out, stick with the cold pressed paper until you start to feel more confident. Then when you're ready, try some hot pressed paper to see if you like it. I hope you found this video interesting. Thank you for watching. As always, give this video a like and hit the subscribe button. And I will see you soon with a new video. Take care. I often get asked why I choose cold pressed paper, and I haven't got my microphone on, so you can't hear me. This is part 1, take 2, take 3, take 20. Got my microphone on now. When I first started painting in watercolour, I used cold pressed paper. When I became more proficient, when I became more proficient, when I became better, when I got better, when I got better. When I first started painting in watercolour, I used cold pressed paper. When I became more proficient, I said it again instead of saying better. Proficient sounds a bit posh. When I first started painting in watercolour, I used cold pressed paper. When I became better, it should be when I got better. When I became better. When I got better, that's better. I'll say when I got better. I'll focus on hot and cold pressed only. I'm also that again. There are, however, 2 exceptions. Whew, it's hot in here.